Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. It's good to have you guys here. We're here to celebrate and talk about this amazing novel, Yellow Wife, from Sadeqa Johnson. Hey, Sadeqa.
Hey, Nancy. Thank you so much for doing this with me. It's so awesome to be in conversation with you tonight.
Oh, thank you. And I definitely want to send a special thank you and shout out to Barbara's Bookstore here in Chicago. Such an amazing host for us. And Barbara's Bookstore is where you're going to want to purchase your copy of Yellow Wife. And yep, that's it. That's it. So you want to get your copy. And if you've already read it, you want to purchase gifts for friends. So definitely from Barbara's Bookstore. And also encourage you to put your questions in the question box, ask a question feature there on your screen. At the end of our time together, I'm going to leave some time at the end, about 15 minutes, to talk with Sadeqa and get all your questions answered. No spoilers, of course, but anything. I know she's willing to talk, about details about the book, anything about her writing process. She's very open to that. So we're going to have this real laid back, cool conversation. I want to start with a bio, though, for Sadeqa. Sadeqa Johnson is the award-winning author of 4 novels, including the fabulous Yellow Wife. Her accolades include the National Book Club Award, the Phyllis Wheatley Book Award, and the USA Best Book Award for Best Fiction. She is a Cambilio Fellow, a former board member of the James River Writers, a tall poppy writer. Originally from Philadelphia, she currently lives near Richmond, Virginia, with her husband and 3 children. Again, Sadeqa, welcome, welcome. I'm excited that we get to be together. And for people who don't know, Sadeqa and I met a few years ago. I think it was 2018.
Yeah, pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, right? When people could still gather safely, and it was not even a thing.
Right.
But we were together in Taos, New Mexico, at the Cambilio Fiction Retreat for Black writers. And it was such a great experience. And I don't know if you remember this, Sadeqa, but there were 4 or 5 of us with the last name Johnson.
Yeah, we were in our class too. It was you. There was at least 3 of us in our cohort.
I know. And we would walk in and people would be like, there goes the Johnson family.
Yes.
And we're no reason, right? But yeah, it was just such a great opportunity to get together with other Black writers and to work on our craft. And I remember being in workshop with you and reading an excerpt of Yellow Wife.
And the excerpt that I submitted was the beginning of, I think, part 2 of the book. And that's what I submitted. And I read an excerpt of The Kindest Lie.
Right.
In workshop. So we were grinding, at the same time on these new books, back in 2018.
We were. And I don't think I introduced myself properly. See, I'm Nancy Johnson,
yes.
An author of a debut novel, The Kindest Lie, coming out in paperback February 1st. So it's been so much fun to be on this journey together with you, with our books coming out. I think it was our hardcovers came out, a month apart?
Yeah, it was January 12th.
And I was February 2nd. So so we were just, a month apart. And, for me, it was my first. You've written, many novels, and you've been so wonderful in talking to me about what that experience is like. And there are so many pinch me moments on this journey. And you just had an incredible one with your book being named the Barnes & Noble pick for fiction for this month. And I am so excited for you. I want to know everything. How did that all go together?
So, thank you. It's every author's dream to have a pick, right? We want some sort of pick. We want a Jenna Bush pick. We want a Reese pick. We want an Oprah pick. We want a pick.
That's the other one.
Yes, we want to pick. And so, when the hardcover came out, I kept, did anyone pick it? Did anyone pick it? And they were like, well, we're still waiting, so it came out and it did what it did. And it had wonderful reach, and I was very proud of Yellow Wife. But when the paperback was starting to go into production, I got a call from my editor. Actually, they sent an email and I completely missed it. Oh, and I am the girl who checks her email literally every 20, 30 minutes because I think Michelle Obama is looking for me and that
Right,
she's
right.
going to reach out to me via email and invite me to
Really.
something, right? So I'm constantly checking. This day I didn't check my email. And so my agent calls me and she's like, "You didn't reply." I'm like, "Reply to what?" And she's like, "Oh, you don't know." And so she was like, "I need you to sit down." But Barnes and Noble selected Yellow Wife for the January pick and for
Oh,
fiction. And she said, "Your life is about to change." And literally, it has, because it is amazing to see people tag me from Hawaii saying that they're standing in a Barnes and Noble and they're holding up a copy of Yellow Wife. And so that's just been amazing.
that is phenomenal. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. That's just great.
But I still want you guys to click on the beautiful green link down below and get your copy of Yellow Wife from Barbara's Bookstore,
That's
because
right.
that is where we are tonight and that is who we are celebrating, and we want to support our independent local bookstores.
Yeah, we always want to do that. So yeah, Barbara's Bookstore for sure. So now I just want to get into conversation about the actual book. So tell us a little bit about the book. And when you tell a story, really well, people want to know, like this one, people want to know, is it based on a true story? And so tell us about the book and then whether it's based on something real. We know slavery
Sure.
is real, but is this
Yeah.
a true story?
So, Yellow Wife is the story of Pheby Delores Brown. She's 17 when the story opens. She's the daughter of the master of the plantation, along with his favorite enslaved woman, Ruth, who is the medicine woman, and she runs the loom house. Well, Phoebe has always known that she's had a promise for freedom. On her 18th birthday, she's supposed to go off and live this very idyllic life in Massachusetts and go to an all-girls school and hopefully meet up with her true love, Essex Henry. Well, a series of events take place and things spiral out of control. And instead of that life that she has been looking forward to, she ends up at the Lapeer jail, which is in Richmond. It's a slave pen and punishing site for enslaved people. And there she catches the eye of the owner, and she has to spend her life outwitting him, not only for herself, but for all the people that she comes to care for. And this story is inspired by the story of Mary Lumpkin. And I discovered her while walking the Richmond slave trail. I moved to Richmond in 2015 and things happened really, really quickly. I literally was standing in my kitchen in New Jersey and I heard a voice that said, "Move." I called my husband up and I said, "I think we need to move, like move, like out of the state move." And he's like, okay. Well, that was February. By June, we were all moved into our new house. And we were just caught up in this flow. Like everything was moving us forward. We found a house, we got schools for the kids, and we have 3 children. So it was a complete uproot for us. But it just felt like we were in the flow. 9 months later, some friends came to visit and we took them on the Richmond slave trail. And I was in between books. I'm walking the trail and I could just feel this energy around me. There was something that kept saying, "Sadeqa, pay attention." And we got to the marker that talked about the Lumpkins jail. And it was described as a punishing center and holding site. But what caught my attention was the owner, who was referred to as the devil because this was the Devil's Half Acres, one of the most horrific places in Richmond. He was married to a Black woman. And I just couldn't stop wondering what life was like for her and what life was like for her 5 children.
Wow, what a story. And just the way that all came about.
Yeah,
I
because
mean,
there was no rhyme or reason for me to be living
yeah,
south of Richmond. I couldn't figure that out.
yeah,
But it was
yeah.
like the
Did you
story
listen to
was
those
waiting for
voices then?
me.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. This was a story you were meant to tell. I just feel like there's this dichotomy in your story between brutality on the one end and then beauty. There's like, and they seem to live side by side and coexist on the page to me. Can you talk about that?
It was definitely a line that I kept towing as I was working through the story. Um, it's a very dark period of history. And so, for me, I'm a lover of love. And all of even my contemporary fictions, everything has a thread of love through it. And I knew that that was a key element because they were still people, they were in horrific situations, but people are people, and we have emotions and we have feelings, and we want to love and we want to be loved. In the harshest conditions, we want to feel loved. And so that was the light that was shining through the story in these dark pages.
Yeah, and that's something that I was going to ask you about, this theme of love, not the mother-daughter type love, the romantic love. Because when you think about romantic love, we don't usually see it in these types of stories,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't see it in many places, quite often, even in our contemporary fiction. Black love is just not always present in media on the page. So was that something you were intentional about doing in this narrative when it came to romantic love?
Yeah, for sure. I remember when Hurricane Katrina happened, and the people were they were displaced, and they were living in the Superdome, and those conditions were very harsh. We remember that situation, but a photographer caught a picture of a boy looking at a girl with this longing, with this attraction. So even in this horrific situation that they found themselves in, they still had an attraction. They still caught each other's eye. And I thought, that's real, that's life. So it was important for me to be able to thread the theme of romantic love through the story, even in these conditions. The mother-daughter love was something that came very early on. The very first scene, when I decided that I was going to write Yellow Wife, and I knew that her name was Phebe, I could see Phebe in the loom house where she lived with her mother, and she was going to bed. And she said, my mother told me recipes. She whispered recipes to me, recipes that she didn't want me to forget, how to mix a tea for dropsy, what you make for consumption. And so these were her healing recipes that her mother was passing down, because they had been passed down to her. And Phebe felt like it was what put her to sleep every night. And just that warmth, that connection between mother and daughter, and in a situation where they had no agency over their lives, they had no control of what was going on, but you could feel the kinship, you could feel the love. And that was really how the story opened up for me when it came.
Yeah, yeah. And then Phoebe is a product of rape on the Bell plantation. Her father, Master Jacob, and that just seemed to open up so much to talk about. And what I appreciate is that Phoebe's mother was able to use the master's lust to really secure freedom for her daughter. It made me think about the Bible verse about, what man means for evil, God uses for good, at least in the intent there. So can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the book?
I always saw Ruth as the mom who was okay with making a sacrifice for her child. And her sole relationship with Master Jacobs was to better Phoebe's situation. And you could see that as she's moving through the story, everything that she's doing. She even says at one point, I know I'm not going to see freedom, but you will. And she was going to do whatever it took to see that promise through. And so she sacrificed her body on a regular basis for the promise that her daughter would see freedom.
That's incredible. And because of that, Phoebe is mulatto. She's yellow, light-skinned, as we sometimes say in our culture.
Or red bone.
Red bone, yeah. Hair, all that. So when you think about, a yellow, woman, wife, how does that benefit a woman in that time period? And also, how did it complicate things for her too? Seemed like they were both.
It was definitely both for Phoebe and for all the women like her that I studied in my research. The benefit was, she didn't have to worry about working in the fields. As we know, those were the harshest conditions on a plantation, is toiling under the hot sun, picking cotton until your fingers are bleeding, or sugarcane, or whatever the crop was. She had meals because her mother, had a connection to the kitchen house, and she knew the kitchen cook very intimately, and was sometimes called up to work in the house. And so anyone who worked close to the big house had a little bit more benefits than those who worked the further away you got from the house, the less benefits that you had. And so, she had the protection also of her father, because he said that, she couldn't be whipped and she couldn't be sold. And, people knew that she was protected, so to speak. So those were the benefits for her. But as her mother says, beauty is a curse for a slave girl. And for Phebe, being quote unquote beautiful was difficult because men lusted after her. She was constantly in sexual danger because, as a woman of, as an enslaved woman, she had no agency. So if her father was not there to protect her, she could be at the mercy of the overseer who could have his way and no one would know anything, So this was that double-edged sword that she was constantly walking throughout the story.
Yeah. What did you want to say about colorism in this book? Was that an issue?
Colorism to me, it plays out in the story the way it plays out in life. It's a constant for us, it's a constant. When you watch television now, you we're just starting to see brown skinned women, on screen. But if you go back in the 40s and the 50s, you just saw the likes of Alina Horn, Dorothy Dandridge, and, people of the lighter shades. And so we're just getting to the point where we're accepting our Afro hair and, being Afrocentric and being on TV and being accepted. But colorism played out greatly on the plantation. The lighter skinned people, they worked up at the house and they had those privileges that I mentioned. And the browner skinned people, they worked in the fields. And we still, as African Americans, feel that rift in our community even today.
Yeah. It's so contemporary with where we are, right now. Did you grow up, kind of reading or watching slave narratives? I know I watched Roots growing up. I still haven't seen 12 Years a Slave, and I know I should.
You could probably only watch it once because it is so real that really you could only stomach it once, but I highly recommend it. So yeah, I grew up reading, my first introduction to, because we weren't taught about slavery in school. And so it was almost something that I kind of stumbled upon. And I remember reading Jubilee by Margaret Walker and then going to my parents like, is this true? Like, did this happen? And so that was kind of my introductory to slavery, was through books. I read Family by J. California Cooper. And then later on, I devoured Winch by Dolan Perkins Valdez. That was a book that I had read twice. And The Kitchen House by Kathleen Grissom and A Known World by Edward P. Jones. These were books that I was reading, not knowing that I was preparing myself to be able to write them. I was really reading them to learn what happened.
Yeah, to learn your history. Gosh, what was painful for you? You were talking about 12 Years a Slave and you can only watch it really once. Was it painful for you to write about pain and brutality, of your own community? What was that experience like for you? Was it very visceral, even though it was so long ago? Like, how did you connect emotionally to that?
It was much more difficult to read it. So as I was studying the text, as I was reading the textbooks about slavery in Richmond, and I was very specific with my research because I knew that slavery in Richmond and in the state of Virginia is going to be very different than slavery in New Orleans, which is going to be very different than living in a coastal town in South Carolina. And so I was very specific about the way I researched the story. But as I'm reading, textbooks about, what it was like for the enslaved people, what really got me is when I was reading actual slave narratives. And so I read Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, which brought you up close and personal to what life was like for her as she moved through the world. 50 Years a Slave by Charles Ball was so informative. And a lot of his stories and things that he encountered, I was able to fictionalize them and put them in Yellow Wife. So as I was writing it, it hurt. But for me, it felt like a duty. Like it was my duty to give a voice to those ancestors who had no voice and to tell their story as truthfully and precisely as I could because it happened. And the very least I could do as a writer was to get it down the way it happened. And I charge my readers with the least you can do is read it because this is our American history, you know?
Yeah, yeah, so true. And I wonder if it was from the slave narratives that you read that I felt like when I was reading that you really got the voice down, the
Mhm.
voice of the characters and the way that they would speak to each other. How did you make that work? And was it from reading the actual narratives from slaves that you picked up on that and made it so authentic?
It was a combination. So, I think, and it's probably true for you as well, like after a while, it's just kind of a movie playing through your head, right?
Mhm.
But when I was trying to get their language down on the page, one of the first things I did was pull out Their Eyes Were Watching God by
Oh,
Zora Neale Hurston.
yeah.
And I literally took the first chapter, and every time she spoke in dialect, I wrote it down on a piece of paper so that I could see what her train of thought was and how she used it. Now, she used it pretty heavily through that story. And I know for contemporary readers, people don't have time for that much in their head, right? It needs to kind of flow. And so I had to figure out where to taper off, but where to keep a little bit in to keep it authentic. And of course, that comes through drafting. So I may have been a little heavy handed up front, but then as I'm drafting, I pull back a little bit, I add a little bit until it's like cooking a stew until you just get that seasoning just right.
Oh, I love that analogy to cooking the stew. Yeah. I'm currently reading the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah Jones, which I think is definitely, about our defining origin story of
Mm.
slavery. And there's been so much pushback, as you know, and I think a lot of people know, to that book and to her as an author, just as there is to, critical race theory and those things right now. But I think it's so much about people wanting to avoid the truth
Yeah.
of our story
Yeah.
and that slavery story.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So tell me how you felt about that. How do you feel about telling that story and the importance of going back and revisiting that story as our origin, as our truth?
Yeah, well, I'm currently reading How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, which is a beautiful, beautiful story. I'm only a few pages in, but I want to say that it's a similar feeling to the 1619 Project,
Yeah.
because he goes into specific plantations and talk about, where slavery began. And from his book, I'm learning that every single thing, and I knew this from my research, and I say this to my children all the time, that every single thing that happens in our country goes back to slavery. Like literally, physically, America was built on the backs of enslaved people. And it started during the period of slavery, but even after slavery ended, the section of his book I'm reading right now, he's talking about how they passed all of these laws so that you could put a Black person in jail for 5 years and then lease them out to work the railroads and to build infrastructure. And so even after slavery, we were still being used in that way. So it all goes back to that. I was in conversation with Robert Jones Jr.
Oh,
from The
that's awesome.
Prophets.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is another very lovely book. He said to me, Sadeqa, do you realize that the jail in Yellow Wife is very similar to mass incarceration of Black and brown people in this country?
That's
And
something.
when I was writing it, that's not something I thought about. I'm just writing the story. But when
Yeah.
he pointed it out, it was like, yeah, because everything goes back to this time period of our history, the birth of it, right? And it's almost like when you have a baby. When you have a baby, you do certain things when they're little because you want them to be able to speak and walk and talk, and then you grow them up, and then that's their foundation. And
Yeah.
and it's very similar to our country.
That is true. And there's such a through line because I think so many people don't want to visit what happened in slavery. Like that happened a long time ago. It has nothing to do with where we are today. But that, like you said, that's the foundation.
Mhm.
Where we are now is the legacy of that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
to understand racism today, you have to look back at where we've
yeah.
been. You know,
Mhm.
so I just think that's so important. But then that also makes me think there are some Black writers, Black authors who say we've had enough of slave narratives, that we want to tell other stories, that there's more to us than the fact that we're slaves. Did you think about any of that as you were contemplating, writing this particular story, that this may not be the right story to tell, or were you always convinced that, yeah, there is a place for this kind of a narrative still?
I was bitten by this story.
Yeah.
It was in my skin. It was running through my blood. It was like a calling from the ancestors. And there was no thought at all, really, of how the book would be received. It was more so, it is my duty to get it down on the page and get it down to the best of my ability and make sure that when I said I was finished, this was the best that I had to offer the world. And how it was received would just be a bonus, but I knew that I had to write this story.
Right. That's the best way to do it. I mean, and it has been received so well. Do you see a difference in terms of audiences and what people take from it? When you look at different races or different people from different backgrounds, do they take different things from it and connect with the story in different ways?
Absolutely. I feel like my audience is either one or the other. So my book clubs today I had all white book clubs today. And so when I was speaking to them, they came wanting to learn more, saying, I've lived in Richmond. I live 5 minutes from the Lumpkins jail, and I had no idea. Teach me more, give me more books so that I could educate myself, And then I have some who are like, oh my gosh, well, was there any, was Master Jacobs? I mean, he was nice, right?
Right.
And so it's kind of like there were some nice people, some nice slave owners, right? So I have the mix of that. And then I have audience, when I'm speaking to a Black book club, or I'm speaking to, an audience of predominantly Black people, they feel like, yes, thank you for telling this story, because, we need to know this. We did not learn this in school, particularly where we live in Richmond. Like, it's here, but you got to dig for it, so it's not readily available. And so I hope Yellow Wife makes this story, makes the life of Mary Lumpkin and women like her more accessible.
Yeah, no, that's great. I want to remind people to get your questions in. So you see the ask a question box. Be sure to ask questions there. I see Anissa Armstrong here. Hi, Anissa. It's always good to see you. Yeah. And I think when you said you're listening to that now, I think you're probably talking about 1619 Project. So yeah, definitely a really good one. I want to talk a little bit about your process as a writer. I know you and I talked on the phone a few weeks ago. We were, just chatting a little bit about writing. So, you have 4 books out. Tell me a little bit about the process. I mean, does it get easier over time? I mean, I only have 1 out. So, and I'm struggling with book 2. They say the sophomore novel is hard. So by the time you get to, 4 books, does this get easier, and is your process more refined?
Well, I have to say this. When I first started writing, my very first novel, Love in a Carry-On Bag, took me 10 years.
Oh.
And it probably was longer than 10 years, but I had to stop counting at 10 years just so that I wouldn't utterly depress myself. But, that first book, you're learning to write. You're learning your voice. You're learning, I didn't outline at all my first book. I was just kind of like throwing it out there and trying to figure it out as I went. Yeah. And when I got to my second book, my agent said, you need a synopsis. Like, you just need to get it all down, like information dump out of your head onto the page. And so then that was my new process, was that I started to write a synopsis so that I would have a bit of a roadmap. And for me, that has made writing a lot easier. So that next book took about 2.5 years, and then my third book came pretty quickly because I was under a 2-book contract. So I really didn't have a choice. But with Yellow Wife, I was in between editors. My editor at St. Martin's Press actually was downsized. And so I was an orphan. And so I was kind of a free agent. So when we decided that I was going to switch to historical fiction, I really went and wrote with no contract, no editor in sight. And I was basically starting over. So that book with the research took me about 2.5 years. I spent probably the first 4 or 5 months exclusively researching. So I was going to visit plantations so that I'm one of those writers that I got to walk the land. I got to smell it, taste it, touch it. I got to feel the air and just kind of imagine. I have to tune into the energy of the people who I'm trying to write. So because it was an ancestral story, I needed to get into their vibration so that as I was writing the story, I was opening myself up so that they could give me the information and that I could just be the typist. It feels like slipping into a portal, you know?
Yeah.
And for me, writing is like acting. I turn my body over, you know, they're crying, I'm crying, they have a
Right.
tummy ache, I have a tummy
You got a
ache.
tummy ache.
Is it like that for you?
It is. I connect so much with these characters and they become real, for me. Yeah, same thing.
You
I know
go
what
to
you mean.
bed
And then to
thinking
hear other
about them.
people talk about them, it's so interesting. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh my God, they
Yeah.
think of them like I think of them, you know?
Yeah.
Because people
Yeah.
say I worry about these characters still. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
you do? Yeah. Because I feel that way when I read, a good book too,
Yeah. You just don't
and
forget it. You don't
you don't
forget those
forget them.
characters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, those characters stay with you. So tell me about the switch over to, from contemporary to historical. Why and how did you make that transition and what has that been like?
It was definitely scary. I was kind of like, why did you pick me? Like, why me? Like, why me? Because I didn't feel like I was qualified. I didn't feel like I had the skill set. I thought that historical fiction was very different than writing contemporary fiction. But when I started the process, I thought, well, one, I need to research because I hadn't done that before to this level because everything had been, I lived in Jersey. I wrote about Jersey. I grew up in Philly. I wrote about Philly,
Yeah.
I was in a long distance relationship. I wrote about that,
Right.
So this was the first time where I had to kind of step outside of myself and create something from scratch, from other areas. So I did a lot of world building. I would say that was kind of where I started. This was the first time that I cut out pictures. I had a picture wall in my office that kind of had, this is what the plantation looked like. This is what I imagine Phebe looking like. And this is what the jail looked like. So that it was so I was constantly surrounded by this story when I went into my office to write. But as I got into it, it started to kind of be okay because writing is still writing. You still got to pace. You still need to know your characters. You still need to have a beginning, middle, and end. You still need to have your plot points as you move through it. And so once I figured that out, it made it a little bit easier. But I will say this, as I was probably on the second draft of the manuscript, I did get into a little bit of a rut. And Marita Golden is one of my writing mentors. Yeah, I took classes with her at the Hurston Wright Foundation.
Hurston
Yeah.
Wright.
Did you ever go to Hurston Wright?
I did go to Hurston Wright. I was in Nicole Dennis Benn's class.
Wait.
The author Nicole Dennis Benn.
So Nicole was in my class, in Marita's class. We were students together.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So we were in the same class.
Later, so after
you went after us. Yeah. So Nicole and I were both.
But she said Marita was her mentor.
Yep. Wow. Yeah, Marita is great. And so I called her up and I said, I'm stuck. And so I'm telling her everything. And she said, Sadeqa, you're not writing a slave story. She said, slavery is the backdrop. You're writing a story about motherhood. You're writing a story about love. You're writing a story about survival. You're writing a story about forgiveness. You're writing a story about struggle. And when she broke it down that way, slavery is just the backdrop. It was like a little click in my brain switched. And it was like, yeah, I have to focus on their everyday lives as human beings. And slavery was just the condition of the story. And I hope that that's what comes through when you're reading the book.
Yes. That really unlocked something for me to think about it that way. So that's, because I'm working on a book now and it's like, it's really about love and family and these relationships and,
Yes.
we complicate it in our minds, especially because this is my first foray into historical fiction, so writing about a time period, at least in one of my timelines that I wasn't, around for, and to try to understand that. But then, when I think about it, kind of what you're saying is like the universality of experience, and so I do know that experience,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I had to figure out. But it was a good 2 or 3 drafts in before I figured that out. So I just saved you a couple of pages, Nancy.
You did. I appreciate this. This is so well worth it, as always, anyway. So you mentioned, drafts, several drafts. So how many drafts again was it for you for Yellow Wife?
For Yellow Wife, I think it was about 7 drafts, 6 or 7 drafts. Yeah. And for me, I normally do 2 drafts by myself before I even show it to anyone. Because that first draft for me is really just like hacking through the woods. I have that synopsis, and it's not even a novella, that first draft. It really is just getting something down on the page so that I can go back and embellish and expand and really make it better. So those first 2 drafts I do on my own. And then the third draft I'll send to my agent and get her comments. And so we'll do like 3 and 4 together. And so by the time it gets to the publisher, we're probably about the 5th draft.
The 5th draft. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What's the biggest change from, where you started, from where the book ended up, from beginning to, first draft to the final book?
So I'll tell you this, the beginning of the book changed. So that scene that I told you about, there in the bed and the recipes and the mom. So when my editor got it, she was like, yeah, this feels real typical. She's lovely. She said,
she's sounds like.
She said, if I hadn't kept reading through the story, I probably wouldn't have been interested. She was like, the first couple of pages didn't really grab me. It wasn't until I got to this point. And so I thought, so she said, I want you to reimagine the beginning. And so that's what I had to do. So that was really the biggest change. That when she gave it back to me, I had to reimagine the beginning. And I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, the beginning, once I write the beginning, that's the beginning.
That's the beginning, right? That's it, right?
That's where it starts. So having to reimagine the beginning, this has never happened. And so I pouted a bit.
I bet.
Yeah.
I pouted, because at least for a first book, when you're writing that beginning, that's the part I was reworking over and over again, at conferences and at so many places, I would go, I was reworking it. And so I'm like, this is shining unlike anything else.
Right. Those first 50 pages are gleaming.
Right?
So that was the biggest change, is that I had to reimagine the beginning. And, she just helped me a lot with pacing and just pointing out things that maybe were in my head, but it wasn't down on the page. She would ask questions and I'm like, wait, no, I knew the answer. And she's like, yeah, you didn't write that, so little things like that. And that's why it's good to have wonderful professionals. I recognize that I am the writer, but I am not an editor. I am not an agent. So when they give me feedback, I listen.
Yeah, I think the best thing for me of working with an editor is there's this vision I have in my head. And by the time the editor works with me on it, at the end, it's like what's on the page more closely matches what had been in my head. Because I have something beautiful in my head,
Yes, of course you do.
That, it doesn't come out the same on the page, the first few drafts. It's just interesting how you could keep refining something and making it beautiful,
It's like shining a diamond in the rough. You just keep rubbing it and rubbing it and rubbing it until it's shining.
I know. All right. And then, okay, let's see, I'm looking at comments. I see that Anissa said that she still thinks about Midnight is from my novel, The Kindest Lie, and then Pheby from Yellow Wife. Yeah, that's something when you find characters like that that you just identify with, and you can't stop thinking about them. So I want to go look at some of the questions that have come in. The first one for both authors: what do you know now that you wish you knew as you started your writing career?
Wow. So I think what I know now is that writing takes patience, but it also takes diligence. So you have to be patient. The story is going to come when the story is ready to come. You can't really rush it out, but you also have to be diligent, meaning that you have to show up every day that you say you're going to show up for your writing, for your characters, so that you're there. So you're like, I'm here. Right? So come on, speak to me, do your part, because I did my part by showing up. but you also need to be patient with the process, because it takes what it takes. And like I said earlier about the stew, you're not going to just put it on the table and serve it. You keep tasting it and adding a little bit more and
Yeah.
tasting it and stirring it, and you got to let it simmer. And so for me, it would be patient, Sadeqa, but
Yeah.
also be diligent. What about you?
Yeah. I think some of the same things you've said. Also for me, just going back to childhood, I was bullied a lot as a kid, and I figuratively lost my voice. And through this process of writing a novel and seeing it come to fruition, be published, have people receive it so well, it's taught me that I have something important to say, that I do have a voice and that my voice matters. And I wasn't always convinced of that. And so that's something that I wish I had known. Really, I wish I had known as a little girl that my voice mattered. And I think I would have just saved myself so much grief and angst over the years. So yeah, that's the big thing. And also to know that the story I have to tell is the story I have to tell, and that there is a place for it in the market. Because I think we spend so much time sometimes as writers and as authors, looking at somebody else's paper like you would in school, looking at somebody else, see what they're doing, and comparing journeys, and thinking, well, if that person made it, maybe that means that it's not for me, and that I won't be able to make it in this industry, and all that self-doubt that can be paralyzing.
Absolutely.
I wish I had known that that's a bunch of BS, that's not the case. And that there's room for, and also I think sometimes, even within, being Black authors, like there's room for Sadeqa and for Nancy.
Yes. Even though we're both Johnsons, there's room for both of us.
Right. There's room for us to both have extraordinary stories to tell.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes there's that competition as you're going along early in your career, but also even at this point. I just focus on my path.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, I love that. I have to also be careful with social media because I can very quickly come down off my natural high because I'm like, oh my gosh, well, how come that author is doing X, Y, and Z? What about me? What about me? So I have to be really careful to kind of, take care of myself and protect those feelings too, and not get into that. What about me?
Yeah. That is something that just dogs us, I think, continually sometimes, that comparison, So I definitely agree on that. And also looking at the reviews and all that stuff too, that can get in your head.
It can, yeah.
Yeah, I had someone do this was really early on. Someone did a video, like a whole video to talk about my book. And it was all this criticism. And I thought, and I was like, that brought me down for days, I kept thinking about it. I couldn't stop,
Yeah, I had someone do that on YouTube as well. And I was like,
it may have been the same chick.
Might have been. It might have been. But like you, I was like, oh my gosh. But you gotta bounce back. Like you can't stay there. Yeah. You can't, because you know what? Another thing that Marita said to me, she said, you have created a world that did not exist. Be proud of yourself. Everybody can't do that. So it doesn't matter what anyone says. You have created a world. You've created nothing, a world out of nothing, all from up here. And everybody can do that.
They can't. It's really special. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
All right. The other question, and anyone else, if you have questions, please put them in the ask the question box. So what were your favorite books that you read growing up? And when did you write? And when did you write? And when did you decide you wanted to be a writer? That's the question. Yeah.
So growing up, there weren't a lot of books by Black authors for YA that didn't exist. So when I was and I had to pass the library to get to my elementary school. So the library was our hangout. So I read Judy Blume. I read Sweet Valley High Girls. I read Joanna Hurwitz. I read, all of those types of books. And then when I got to high school, I discovered Maya Angelou. And I read her 4 autobiography books. And I was so into it because I feel like that's probably the first time or at least one of the first times that I saw a Black woman on the page. And I would read so much that my best friend would steal my books at lunch,
Oh,
because I would like sit in a corner and in the lunchroom, and I would read, and everybody would be outside jumping double dutch. And
yeah.
she's like, come on outside, so she would hide my books from me. But then it was Mama by Terry McMillan that
Mm.
really changed everything for me. Like, that book awakened something inside of me. And then I was just kind of on a path. I didn't know that I wanted to actually be a writer. I actually went to college as a theater arts major. I wanted to be on Broadway. So I went to
Right.
college in New York City,
I
and I
can totally
thought, well,
see
I was like, I'm not even here to get a degree. I'm here to live in New York City. So I'm thinking I'm only going to be in school for like 2-3 weeks, and then I'm going to get discovered. I'm going to have to leave school and go and perform and travel around the country. Well, that didn't happen. I got a degree and then I had to get a job. And it
Yep.
was, yeah, then it was at that first job I worked in publishing. That's when I started writing my first book. How about you?
Okay. Yeah. I don't even think I knew you worked in publishing. Yeah. So, yeah, for me, what I tell people, at book clubs and when I do interviews is that I started, reading and writing was like important to me as early as kindergarten, because I had one of those memory books. I don't know if you had those, but it was a book where you would fill out like your favorite activities, starting with kindergarten, going through 12th grade. So I was such a nerd. So I kept those
Oh,
little books and filled them out. And so in my terrible, scribbly handwriting, when I was 5 years old, I wrote my favorite activities were reading and writing. So I feel like I've been doing it since then. But like you, I grew up not seeing myself represented on the page. My favorite books, though, were Nancy Drew mysteries, probably because it was my namesake. And for a long
mm-hmm.
time, I wanted to be a detective. And yeah, so I have like 60 of those. I'm
Wow.
keeping them, storing them in my mother's garage, much to her chagrin. But yeah, those were my favorites. But I was also a Judy Blume fan too. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so those were the books I was reading. And it's so interesting that years later, I look back on it and realize that I wasn't seeing myself on the page. But at the time, I didn't know enough to know
Yeah.
that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this was a good story. And I didn't know what I was really missing. So I wasn't necessarily craving that, seeing Black characters, because to me, what I was reading and seeing was normal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's
Because
all.
it was also reflective of what we saw on TV.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was all, just normal for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I went to college, I read, I took African American literature and started reading Toni Morrison. And I have to say that I was not mature enough, as a reader at the time to appreciate her work. And it wasn't until much later that I really began to appreciate her. Because at the time I was like, oh, is it so tough? It's so difficult. It's so dense,
Mm-hmm.
But I just wasn't sophisticated, in my reading at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of writing, knowing that I was going to be a writer, I studied journalism, so I knew I was going to be a journalist. So I knew that my career would be about, writing.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until after a career in journalism and then moving into corporate communications and all that, that I kept thinking, you know what, my entire career I've been telling other people's stories, people's stories who are making news and all that. And so I decided it's time for me to tell the stories of my own imagination. And then that's when I started thinking about
When
fiction.
was that moment for you, though? What do you remember, like, what that moment was like?
I don't. I just remember the frustration that I was feeling with what I was doing.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
remember thinking, this is not enough. This is not fulfilling for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I need
Mm-hmm.
something more. And I'm a storyteller, and this is what I want,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
I'm not interested in chasing ratings or trying to build somebody else's brand, which I am interested in that for the money, because I got to make money. But, to take care of to support my writing, my fiction writing habit.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I knew there was something more that was a passion of mine, but I don't know if there was a one defining moment, but it was just kept building
Yeah.
to a certain point. And then I said, I need to explore this,
Yeah.
and there are so many people that I don't even remember, but people in my past who are like, oh, I remember when you used to always talk about wanting to do this. And then they were, you used to go to all those workshops. And I remember this being your dream. And I didn't even know I had the dream that long.
Yeah.
Yes, I had it,
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, but here we are now.
Here we are.
I know, I know. Let's see, what is this other comment here? I could use some middle grade and YA books in my library by Black authors. Y'all write some, please?
There are so many out now. I have a 11th grade daughter and an 8th grade daughter, and much to my chagrin, they are not the readers that I was. And I'm like, you guys, look at the wealth of books that are available. You know, you should be reading, you know, Nick Stone and
Yes.
Angie
Yeah.
Thomas, and they have read Jason Reynolds, though. They
Yeah,
definitely love Jason Reynolds. But there are just so many. There are just so many right now.
I know, I know. Yeah, that's something to think about. I'm always thinking about, you know, what other things could I be doing? You know, could I explore, you know, maybe a different age range, another genre, you know, explore nonfiction in addition to fiction. I feel like there's so much out there to explore and not enough time.
The sky,
To write all the books.
the sky is the limit. The sky is
I
definitely the
know.
limit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, everyone, I encourage you all to definitely buy Yellow Wife. You know, that's it. Buy Yellow Wife from Barbara's Bookstore, please. So I want to just thank you so much, Sadeqa. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I also want to thank Barbara's Bookstore. You know, what a wonderful host. And, you know, we really appreciate having us, you know, hosting us for this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much too. I haven't been to Chicago in such a long time, but I feel like I'm in Chicago right now.
I know, you're feeling the Chi-Town love.
I'm feeling it. And I just thank you so much for joining me in conversation and celebration of Yellow Wife. I'm so proud of you. And for those who do not know, The Kindest Lie, can you tell your big news for February?
Yeah. So Kindest Lie is the February book club pick for Target. So I'm really excited about that and all the special promotion that will happen for The Kindest Lie. So
that's big. That's awesome. But we still want you to get your paperback copy of The Kindest Lie from Barbara's.
From Barbara's, yes.
From Barbara's. That's right.
Paperback.
That's right. And paperback. That's right.
I know. It's so much fun to have our books have this new life in paperback. So. Yeah, so thank you so much, everybody,
Thank
for
you
joining
all.
us. All right.
Have a good night. We appreciate it. Bye-bye.